my pleasure to welcome another distinguished professor, which is Michelle Leishman from Macquarie University. Where is Michelle? Here she is. Michelle is an expert in ecological restoration in riparian, woodland and urban environments. She's done extensive work into weed management and myrtle rust strategies. She's highly cited with over 170 published book chapters and journal articles, and much of her work is being translated into not just on-the-ground advice, but also policy advice. Her current project or research focuses on resilient landscapes, so resilient and diverse green urban spaces, and she's leading the Which Plant Where project. So please join me in welcoming Michelle to the chat.
Thanks very much, Heather, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure indeed. I really enjoyed this morning's session. Thank you, Costa, and the students. I thought whoever's idea that was a genius idea, because connecting the next generation to the extraordinary amount of expertise and knowledge in this room is essential. And I would like to be able to extract all of that botanical knowledge that you have in your brains and pop it into my memory bank somewhere, because the knowledge within the APS is extraordinary, and we need to tap into it more. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about building resilience. So I am going, David's was a bit depressing, wasn't it? It's depressing. I'm going to start off with a bit of depressing and then move forward to where we need to be. So I don't need to tell you guys that Australia's flora is something to be celebrated. We are amazingly lucky to live on this continent. This is a continent of fantastic floral diversity. We have over 22,000 described plant species, and almost all of them are endemic. It's an amazing continent. 14 endemic families. I don't need some audiences. I tell them what the Myrtaceae are and the pea families and all of that sort of stuff. I don't need to do that here. You guys know what an amazing landscape we have, what amazing diversity we have. Biodiversity hotspots, so these are 15 recognised biodiversity hotspots nationally. Most of them are underpinned by the floral diversity. In fact, we have international biodiversity hotspots, which of course are the southwest WA, the wet tropics, and also the eastern forests as well. So, we are on the international stage. We punch above our weight in floral diversity. If there was an Olympics, we'd be very proud. But our ecosystems are in trouble. So the graph on the left shows primary forest loss and tree cover loss in tropical Australia, and it also includes New Guinea. So we think that we are past the days of habitat clearing. That is not the case. We still clear an enormous amount of habitat, which in my opinion is a national disgrace. And you can see the outcome of that on the figure on the right. And so the pinky areas are the areas of most modification, and so our landscapes are most modified obviously in the southwest corner of WA in that floral biodiversity hotspot, and through the east coast, the southern and east coast regions. So we have transformed the landscape dramatically. Our ecosystems are also in trouble from climate change. So the graph on the left shows Australia's climate. That's the temperature anomaly. So above the horizontal line is where it's hotter than the baseline comparison, and the temperatures have been going up and up and up. So we're about 1.4 degrees above the long-term average. The figure on the right is rainfall, and so we have had declining rainfall in the southern parts of the continent, particularly the southeast and southwestern corners, but increasing rainfall in the north and the northwest. Rainfall is much harder to project into the future, but we're pretty confident that we have both a warming and a drying continent generally. But it's the change in the extremes that really matter. So if you look at that graph on the bottom, that's the probability of occurrence. So what we need to do is shift the mean a little bit, 1.1 degree, 1.52 degrees. Doesn't seem like very much, but that's shifting that frequency distribution to the right, and then what we see is that more extremes, the intensification of our wetting and drying cycle, of our water cycle, so more flooding, more extreme heat, these sorts of things. And we're seeing that playing out in the environment, so you can see the pictures on the right of sort of extensive areas of dieback that we got after the drought periods. So what's climate change doing? We're seeing changes in hydrology, so things like saltwater intrusion of our freshwater wetlands. We're seeing intensification of the fire regime, so the sorts of things that David's been showing us so dramatically. So we see changes in vegetation composition and disruption of interactions between, with our pollinators, our seed dispersers, and changes with pests and pathogens. We also have invasive species. So I think it was mentioned earlier, someone mentioned that we have more exotic species on the continent than we have native species, which is a pretty amazing number. Of course, not all of those are invasive. There's a relatively small number of those. A couple of hundred are known as the big bad guys. But we see this both in our marine realms as well as in our terrestrial systems. And those invasive plant species, they have direct impacts. They might be out competing and smothering vegetation like those vines, but also indirect impacts. So changes in fire regimes like the gamba grass there, that's in the Northern Territory, that intensifies the fire regime as well. Changes in nutrient cycling, changes in hydrology, all sorts of those flow-on ecosystem impacts. And pathogens. So Phytophthora, particularly in Western Australia, you can see their Banksia die-off in WA, and myrtle rust here in the east. So, inappropriate fire regimes. I don't need to talk about this. David's already talked about fire and what it's doing for us. But in fact, in New South Wales, we actually have our key threatening process, high-frequency fire resulting in the disruption of life cycle processes in plants and animals and loss of vegetation structure and composition. So that's a lot of wordiness. But we've recognised for a while now how important changes in fire frequency are for our vegetation and flow-on effects for our fauna as well. So lots of the endangered ecological communities, lots of our species in the listing process, inappropriate fire regimes are one of the threats that are listed for them. And sometimes we're beginning to see transformations. So these are the Gondwana rainforests that burnt in the Black Summer fires. Many people thought we would never see in our lifetime fires like this. And these sorts of pictures in Tassie make my heart die a little bit every time I look at them. So these are the sorts of transformational changes that we are seeing in our ecosystem. So these are the Kimberley and pencil pine forests of the Central Plateau in Tassie. So what is happening with that? So all of these, that's all the bad news, what's going on. So under our federal legislation, we assess and list species as threatened with extinction. So we have 37 species listed as extinct, a bit over 200 as critically endangered, and about 500 in each of those two categories, endangered and vulnerable. So that's about 6% of our flora that's recognised as threatened. But of course, that's only the ones that have been assessed and recognised. The number is likely to be much higher. That's the nature of the listing process. It takes a long while to get species nominated and through the whole system. And of course, we're seeing an extinction lag effect as well will play out. So you can see the picture on the right is the number of threatened species per bioregion, and the darker colours are where there's more of them, and it's in those places where you can see that it matches the pattern of those modified landscapes, so southwest WA and right up through the east coast. New South Wales here, similar sorts of numbers. This is from the State of Environment Report 2021 snapshot. So we have about a bit over 4,500 species in New South Wales recorded, and about 14% of them are listed as threatened, and that's recognising that this is where much of the landscape modification on the continent has played out. So that's all the bad stuff. So what can we do to build resilience? Thinking about this from the landscape scale down through to the species level. So this is the sort of stuff that I would teach my students in conservation biology, is that we need to think at the landscape scale about protecting landscapes, about connecting landscapes, about restoring landscapes, managing threats, and then right down through the species level, how do we manage populations to make sure that they persist in the long term. So let's start off with protection. So there's our national reserve system. About 23% of our landscape is in the national reserve system. That includes things like national parks, but it also includes the IPAs, the Indigenous Protected Areas. It includes private conservation reserves. So I'm a director of Bush Heritage. We have a lot of that, a lot of those pieces of coloured area on the landscape. Bush Heritage Reserves, for example, AWC is another one. And covenants and private conservation, extensively across the continent. Under the Convention for Biological Diversity, the post-2020 framework, the targets are 30% of the continent to be preserved in the National Reserve System. So we're seeing all sorts of partnerships happening, and we need to get from that 23% up to 30% at least. But they need to be in representative areas and covered across all of those bioregions. Connecting landscapes, we're seeing various things going on with connecting landscapes, both on the west coast, so that's Gondwana Link, that's on the west coast, connecting right through from the Margaret River up through the Fitzsterling Range. And again, we see, it's a mixture of national parks, it's a mixture of private conservation groups, the environmental NGOs, private landholders, joining together to make those connections in the landscape. And similarly on the east coast, that's the Great Eastern Ranges Conservation Corridor. So, again, these big movements, it takes a lot of time to get these off the ground and to get people working together, but that's all about partnerships, right? No one body can do this. It's all about partnerships and people working together to connect habitat. Identifying which parts of the landscape we should protect. So David talked about fire refugia. This is climate refugia. So we can do the modelling and look to see what parts of the landscape is the climate being climatically stable through time and have been for thousands of years. So we can identify which species, for example, represent the highest richness of in situ climate refugia, and which we define as areas that remain suitable for at least 50% of that ecoregion's representative species. So we can do the mapping and the modelling, and then we can make sure that those areas in particular are protected. And then, of course, climate refugia also works down at the species level. So this is the extraordinary story that we heard in the Black Summer fires with the efforts to save the one-night pine. So you can see that aerial photo there. They were protected. A lot of, bombing of fire retardant. There were people down there in the gullies. There was watering systems put in, an extraordinary effort to save that one particular species. And we've seen, so we need to, preserve those gullies, keep them safe, but also have insurance populations elsewhere. So that's the people on the right with those seedlings that are going to be planted out for those insurance populations. So part of connecting landscapes is often not just the habitat that is still in good condition, but also replanting and restoring and making those, bridging the gaps. We are in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, and we've heard this morning about our students came up, a bunch of them were working in land care and bush care and doing bush regen and so on. That's certainly what I see in my area is bush care groups. We have 750 bush care volunteers in my local government area, for example. So restoration going on across the continent in all sorts of different places. We need to target it very carefully. We need the sort of scientific evidence to show us how we should do it. Should we be burning? What sort of soil conditions should we use? What are the right conditions for getting planting to achieve and have successful outcomes? We see the publication of the national standards for the practice of ecological restoration. We have an Australian Association of Bush Regenerators. A lot of activity going on and has been for decades, but we need to do it in a much more targeted and careful way. One of those things that we really need to think about is that when we're doing restoration, that we think about it and try to make it what we call climate ready. So we've had some work. This was driven by my colleague Noel Hancock, climate ready revegetation work that we did in New South Wales. And so that publication, you can download it off the web. It provides a step-by-step guide for doing climate ready revegetation. It has different strategies that you can think of and how you might manage your restoration and the mix of species and the mix of provenances that you use. And it has this whole toolbox of resources of where to find the sort of information that you need. So you can think about when you're doing your replanting, should it be adjusted for climate? Is your site particularly climate exposed? What sort of provenances or what sort of species would you have there? How would you do the right mixture? So we're seeing that playing out. We're seeing there's some climate ready re-veg that's gone on in New South Wales. We see it in the Yes Land Care Group are doing that. This is Bush Heritage's work at Nadu Hills in Victoria. So this was done in partnership with Greenfleet. So they had substantial dieback of grey box and yellow box, I think. So what they chose to do was look at 3 different future climate scenarios. So they used Cyro's work on this and then mixed that up with the local provenance. So they've got a mixture of provenances that they're planting and hoping to build resilient forests through time that way. So restoration is important, climate ready restoration is even more important. So how do we manage the risk from invasive species as we move into the future and manage and try to build resilience? And so that can range from all sorts of things. It can be using technology, for example, there's a drone on the right-hand side in our iconic landscape, so that's Kosciuszko National Park, where we're looking for hawkweed. It's difficult to find the drones, and a combination of the drones and the sniffer dogs means that we can find it, see it in the landscape and eradicate it. It might be using LiDAR technology, so that's gamba grass in the Northern Territory, and we're looking at and mapping that with, so you can do 3D mapping of gamba grass and see, manage the invasion front that way. And in particular, it's that combination. We need to think as the climate changes, the fire regime changes, we have more extreme events. That's when the weeds get their foot in the door, right? And so when we need to think about the combination of having exotic species in the landscape and those extreme events, making sure that once the flooding's gone, receded, once after the bushfire's gone, that we do that sort of post-fire bush regime targeted management to keep the weeds under control and give the native plants a bit of a chance. This is some work that we did a number of years ago. This is the Weed Futures website. Looking very glamorous up there at the Eureka Awards a couple of years ago for this. So for this, what we did was we have more than 750 species that we've done bioclimatic mapping for, so you can look up each of these species on the Weed Futures website and find out, well, where are the areas of climatic suitability for that species into the future. So we can target particular areas, we can ensure that we can do preemptive monitoring of regions, we can do targeted species management under climate change. So I wanted to talk briefly about something Costa mentioned. Thank you very much, Costa, for plugging this one for me. So this is the Gardening Responsibly program. So we want to make sure that we don't get any more of these, the lantanas and the privets and the asparagus grass, the asparagus fruit for the future. We need to make sure that we stop that and we don't, create any more of these monsters. So this is a risk assessment tool for ornamental plants. It's the foundation of this Gardening Responsibly program. It was funded through the National Trust and the nursery and garden industry, and it is a program that the website's up and going, and it's like dolphin friendly tuna or something, right? So when you go into Woolies or Coles and you make your choice, if it's got the green tick, then you choose, or for health or your heart risk or whatever it might be, This is for when you go in the nursery and you choose your plants, so that the plants that are of low risk will have that certification label on them. So we've done we designed the risk assessment model that underpins the program, but the program is much more than the science. The program is about engagement, it's about education, it's about changing people's mindsets, and that they understand the risk of invasive species and that they choose to do a low risk species and purchase something that they know won't jump over their garden fence and be a problem in the decades to come. So it's not just invasive species that were a problem. Pathogens are also increasingly be a problem. We'll see this also with climate change, so we need to look to the future for this. So myrtle rust is one of those. It affects, you can see the little yellow pustules. Myrtle rust affects the myrtaceous species in the myrtaceous family. It's native to South America. It's affecting our eucalypts, tea trees, paper barks, bottle brushes, things like that. So you can see the red mark where it is. It started off on the central coast. It's spread all up and down the east coast. It's in New Zealand now. It's in the Tiwi Islands. I actually heard the other day it's also in WA, which is not good at all. But we've done the bioclimatic modelling so the approach that we can take with this is to look at where the climate suitability is for myrtle rust. Then we overlapped that with the occurrence records for the just over 2,000 myrtaceous species. That led us to go, well, which species are at risk? Which species are in areas where there's a very high climate suitability for the myrtle rust pathogen now and in future climates? And then we can compile all of that data on susceptibility and threat status of the species, so we can focus on endangered species and then prioritise species for conservation based on their susceptibility, on their threat species, if they're endangered or not, and the overlap of all of those things. And so that's contributed then to that National Action Plan for myrtle rust, and there are now 16 species that are on the trajectory of extinction, unfortunately, from myrtle rust, and then so that we can do that targeted conservation action. So those species are being targeted for germplasm collection, working out how to germinate those species and how to propagate them, making sure that we understand the genomics of the populations, understanding what's going on with the myrtle rust, and doing seed orcharding and managing populations of these 16 species, both in situ and managing ex situ populations as well. So a lot of work, particularly with botanical gardens and things like the Saving Our Species program in New South Wales. So that's mostly been sort of landscapey level things, but we can do a lot of stuff at the population level as well. So this becomes sometimes a little bit more controversial when we think about translocating plants and how brave we need to be in the future managing our amazing diversity under all of these threats that we're facing, in particular climate change. So what can we do? So we can think about how we, as we get up to increasing levels of controversy. So replanting declining populations is a no-brainer. That's pretty straightforward. Plants are declining in a particular place, or they're at threat from a development. We can replant and augment populations. We can restore extinct populations. We can establish populations in there where we knew they occurred before, but they have become locally extinct. We can reintroduce into those populations, into those areas. And we can begin to think about, and I think we need to be doing this, is establishing new populations beyond their historic range. So understanding where areas will be climatically suitable, and then being brave and moving species to ensure their long-term persistence. So there's been, there's translocation operational guidelines produced by the various state agencies. ANPC has also their guidelines for translocation of threatened plants in Australia. So we see a lot of this in WA in particular. They seem to be the leaders of being doing these translocation work. There's a couple of species there where the seeds have come down, species have come down to just a few individuals. The one on the right, the Grevillea, there was only 53 mature individuals at a single site. They collected seeds over a number of years, worked out how to germinate them, and have been planting into new sites. The one on the left, those sites have been affected by a Phytophthora, so they've identified Phytophthora-free areas that will be climatically suitable and planted into those. So the graph shows the number of translocations of threatened Australian plants per year up to 2017. So there's a fair amount going on, and certainly you can see how it's increasing through time, but very little of it is published. Right, so the work is done, but not much publication. So it's hard for us to learn what to do and what things work unless we publish. So if you're involved in any of these translocation things, then I do encourage you to work with people who are used to doing publication so that we can get it out there, so that we can learn from our mistakes and also our successes. So staying at the species level, this is some examples of other work. So this is some work with the New South Wales Saving Our Species program and the Australian Institute of Botanical Science, which is underneath the Botanic Gardens. So work on groups of species. So this is the orchids. Orchids are particularly diverse, particularly amazing, particularly hard to propagate and have germination success with. So lots and lots of work that goes on in understanding how they germinate, what their mycorrhizal requirements are, how to keep them in storage, what the pollination systems are, what the demography and so on are, so that we can do this species population augmentation, restoration, and translocation in some cases. So I'm going to switch a little bit to urban areas. This is something that I've been working in for a couple of years now, and remembering that even our urban areas are a very small proportion of the continent. Actually, there's a remarkable diversity of species in them. Everything within natural woodland areas to people's residential gardens to parks and gardens, golf courses, all sorts of places is amazing plant diversity. So we collated information across the globe. We pulled together tree inventory data from nearly 500 cities across the globe, just to go, well, what's out there? What's in our cities? And we found globally that nearly 8% of the known global flora was found in cities, so 1,200 genera, 175 families. There were 6 species, which are the ones that are shown there in the pictures, that are extinct in the wild and only occur within cities. There was a bunch of critically endangered and vulnerable species as well within the list. And so that's the work that we did, which we call the GUDI database, the Global Urban Tree Inventory. So it's, just shows you what's in our cities and shouldn't be overlooked. Some work by other people have looked at the plant populations within cities, and they showed that 30% of Australia's threatened species have populations within cities. So we shouldn't forget about our urban spaces as well. But our urban forests, so we call those areas, whether it's the remnant vegetation or the street trees or people's houses and gardens, we can put that all together and call it the urban forest. So this is data from 60 local government areas across Australia. Again, we pull that tree inventory data together. So there's more than 1 million tree records in the data set. That represents 1,200 species. So you go, well, that looks pretty good. That's diversity. But the word cloud, so you know how word clouds work. The bigger it pops out as the more abundant it is within the database. And you can see, there's just a few species names that pop out. It's Lophostomus and, red gums and Callistemon viminalis and things like that. So more than half of our urban forest is represented by 30 species, right? That is not diversity. That is setting yourselves up for long-term disaster. And yet, we know how important our urban forests are. So we know the advantages the benefits that they give us. They help us with cooling in extreme events. They help with trapping pollutants. They're enormously important for managing the water cycle within urban areas, stormwater management and so on. They reduce the energy costs because we don't have to air condition our houses so much if we have shading and evaporation benefits from trees. They support biodiversity, they make us healthier, and they're an enormously useful educational resource as well for connecting people with doing that nature connection that we talked about with earlier this morning with the group that was in this morning. So how important that nature connection is. Many people never leave the city. At least we can connect with them and teach them about plants and the importance of plants by bringing them to them in their urban landscapes. And, we basically need more data like this. So this is some work we did in extreme heat in Adelaide a couple of years ago, where we flew across the city in an extreme heat wave and measured temperature variation and mapped it against different cover of vegetation types and showed that green canopy can reduce temperatures in extreme heat events by up to 6 degrees, which is quite substantial. Think about the difference between like 34 and 40 degrees. But different types of vegetation had different effects, and it was the canopy, like the tree canopy rather than the grasses, that had the strongest effects, not surprisingly. But importantly, it was like the residential gardens shouldn't be overlooked. They're 20% of the land area, but they were 40% of the tree cover. So it's not just about governments planting trees in streets, parks and gardens. It's about our own residential gardens that matter also. But our gardens are feeling the heat, our urban areas are feeling the heat. Heat waves are becoming longer, hotter, happening more often. We have an urban heat island effect as well. So urban forests are going to struggle. And we've done a bunch of bioclimatic modelling of urban species, horticultural species, and looked to see how their climate suitability will shift in the future. And showed that, so we looked at 176 native species that are commonly planted in urban areas, horticultural species, and over 70% of them are going to be uncomfortable in the future in terms of their climate. So we really need to be thinking, we're putting trees in the ground that are going to last for decades in our urban areas, but are they climatically suitable? Are they the right species in the right places? Already we're seeing some of our species struggle, so obvious things like London plane trees and so on, but even things like, so for the East Coast people here, that's Banksia serrata, old man Banksia. I used to think that was tough as old boots, but actually, those big extreme heat weather events, it's curling up its toes and looking very uncomfortable. So we can measure temperatures of leaves, we can do thermal imaging, and we can see that those temperatures are reaching, when the temperature is 40 degrees, the air temperature is 40 degrees, those leaf temperatures are over 50 degrees. So the plants are struggling to keep themselves cool. And you may remember, 4th of January 2020, the hottest place on the planet was in Western Sydney, in Penrith, when it reached 48.9 degrees. So we saw a lot of canopy damage, and so we measured it. We hopped in the air-conditioned car and drove around. That's the best way to do ecology in an extreme heat event, and had our GPS and our inventory and looked out the window and went, yep, that one's got damage, that one's got damage. And we measured 5,500 trees in Penrith, and this is the sort of results that we get. And of course, yes, it's the exotic species that are showed the most vulnerability, showed the most damage, but there were also some of our native species were troubled as well. So things like Acamina, not surprisingly perhaps, and even the callistemons were not happy at all. So this is a really expensive, as an urban manager, forest manager, those trees are damaged. We get another extreme event, they'll be damaged a bit more. Their useful life expectancy is shortened. That's a lot of money to replace them. So local governments need to be thinking about this as well. So if we're going to make sure that our urban forests are resilient into the future, then we need to make sure that we increase diversity. We need more than those 30 common species. We need to make sure that our species that we plant have tolerance of the climate conditions that they will experience in their long lives, low water availability, increased heat, and the changes in the pests and pathogens that will happen with climate change. So this is the work that we've been doing for the last couple of years. This is work with This is the Which Plant Where project. It's funded through the horticultural industry and collaboration with the Department of Planning and Environment. So we did bioclimatic modelling, where we looked at climate suitability in different urban areas for over 2,500 horticultural species. And then we compiled a trait database so that we have information about environmental tolerance, but also information about fruiting and flowering and what they look like and what sort of places in the urban context they are good to plant in. And we did a whole lot of experimental work where we put plants through their paces in the glass house. We treated them badly, we droughted them, we hit them with heat waves and tried to kill them, and then we looked at them and rescored things and did a lot of eco-physiological stuff on them so that we can have information about their environmental tolerance. And we looked at successes and failures. So what's been going on in urban landscapes, how well are trees going, what are the problems faced in the industry and in urban areas, and then we compiled all of that and built a lot of best practice guides which are available on the web on this plant selection tool. So this is the Which Plant Where Climate Ready Species Selection Tool. So there's 2,500 species in there. You can search by location, you can search by species, you can put in a location and then it will tell you what species are climatically suitable for that location. The location works at the postcode or the suburb level. And it's also got a whole lot of resources. There's blogs on there about climate change and building resilient urban landscapes and how to do it and monitoring and maintenance and all sorts of things. So this is what the pages look like. Every single species has its own species profile page, and it's got information on climatic suitability in relation to a specific postcode that you put in, and then there's all of those maps and so on that appear as well. So just other things that are going on. So in terms of building resilience, we've got urban forest demonstration sites happening. So I'm associated with one at the Australian Botanic Gardens at Mount Annan, where we're testing a whole lot of different species, and then we're testing them with recycled water, the use of recycled water, which will become increasingly important compared to normal potable water, and how they go with different soil amendments, what's their growth and survival. We're looking at, this is also at Mount Annan Botanic Gardens, looking at different climate prominences. So again, trying to get that climate suitability and planting different, so using seed material from different provenances, using different soil amendments to see if we can improve their growth under stressful conditions. So I'm nearly at the end. So this is my kind of plug for creating nature-rich, climate-resilient urban landscapes, not forgetting the importance of urban areas. Do we want to live in an urban landscape that looks like Western Sydney at the top, or would we rather live in a biodiversity-sensitive urban design, beautifully planned urban landscape? I think probably most of us would be more comfortable in that bottom picture than the top picture. But unfortunately, the top picture is what we get. So how can we overcome? How can we tell our politicians that we don't want to live like that? It'll be too hot, it's horrible, it's disconnected from nature. So the more we understand the benefits of plants and urban green spaces, the more we can tell that message. So it's about education and engagement. We need to make sure that we're facilitating that resilience by, increasing the diversity, increasing the climate readiness of the plants that we put in the ground. We need to make sure that we're promoting this sort of biodiversity sensitive urban design, or nature-rich cities, or what sort of terms you want to use. And to do that, sort of what I do in my job is building those partnerships with industry and government and providing them with tools and resources that show them what the ecosystem benefits are, that tell them what sort of plants are suitable for planting. And for that to work, the governance systems and the financial systems have to work, because otherwise land's worth money, and unless we get the financial levers right, then we'll end up with a picture at the top everywhere. So this is the last slide. So to step back away from urban landscapes and think for plant futures, what do we need to do? So I think this is my call to be brave, that there's things that we need to do. So across our landscapes, we need to alleviate the other stresses that, so that we can increase resilience. So that's our weed management, that's our fire management, that's our pest and pathogen management. All of those stresses, we need to alleviate them as much as possible. We need to make sure that we're connecting our landscapes and enabling our plant species to move naturally around the landscape and adapt as far as possible to climate change. We need to know where our climate refugia are and make sure that they're protected. I think we need to make sure that we have this clear sense of active landscape management. Aboriginal people have been managing the land for 60,000 years. Our land is not wilderness, right? It's been managed all of those years, and we can learn from that, and we need to, just can't put land behind a fence and walk away. We need to actively manage it, and we need to understand where we want to get to. So what's the trajectory of managing our landscape into the future? What do we want it to look like? So whether that's climate, and then we've got the tools, climate-ready revegetation, understanding the genomics and the genetics of populations, so where we put and manage our species, and being brave to translocate species, not monitor them until they become extinct, but to do something about it and to make sure that we are brave enough to move and translocate species and to manage genetic diversity and adaptive capacity. So that is my call to arms. Lots of people do help with all of this sort of stuff, lots of different industry partnerships and government and so on. And thank you, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And let's open for questions. Who has a question for Michelle?
James Middleton from Sydney. I was just wondering if there's any justification for planting exotics in our urban landscape.
Yes, I was waiting for this one. So I am an invasion biologist, and I understand very well what the problems are with invasive species, but not all species are invasive. It's a relatively small proportion of those 25,000 exotic species that we have here that are problematic. So we need to focus on those ones that are problematic in terms of containment and management. We need to make sure that we don't have any new ones. And it is like the roof, the dark and the light roof. If you take away people's choice, then you create problems down the line. People want choice. There's a strong demand for having different new varieties, whether it's those bloody gardening shows, I don't know. But, there's this amazing interest in plants of all sorts of varieties. So at the moment, so many exotic species are incredibly useful in terms of, deciduous species, allowing the winter sun to come into small spaces, but providing shade in the summer. We don't have that many native deciduous species that perform the same role in our urban spaces. So there is a place for them. We just need to make sure that we are only planting the low-risk ones, and that's what gardening responsibility is all about. So to make sure that that's what happens in the future. So I know we all love our native species, but plenty of people love exotics. We just need to make sure we're not creating the weeds of the future.
If you enjoyed this presentation, then please subscribe to our channel. Other presentations from the conference are available in this playlist, with new ones being added all the time.